Hey, this is Rylan from the Vic Shop.
And I'm Gabe.
And this is how to better understand your Victory motorcycle. So from a technician standpoint, the Victory motorcycles can be grouped into three distinct eras. The first one is the 1999 to 2001 era. This is represented by this 2001 Sport Cruiser. It's powered by the pre-Freedom motor, which is a 92-inch 5-speed. And then we have the second era, which is an 02 to 07 bike. And here we have an 07 Kingpin. And these were powered by 92 and 100-inch 5 and 6-speed motors. And then you have the 08 to current 2015 bikes, and this one is 2014 cross country, but we'll also consider Visions and all the steel frame bikes from 08 to newer in this category. In today's video, we're going to go over some maintenance, troubleshooting, and repair of your 2008 to 2015 motorcycle. Whether you're a new owner or you're not lucky enough to have a mechanic that's good close by, or you just like to tinker and you don't have a manual, I think this is going to be a great video for you. So let's go check this thing out. So the 2008 to 2015 bikes are defined by their closed-loop fuel injection. Previously, from 1999 to 2007, Victory had used an open-loop fuel injection with no oxygen sensors. Now we're into the closed-loop stuff. And between the 2008 and 15 models, we can divide them into two groups. One would be the core-framed or aluminum-framed bikes, and the other would be the steel-frame bikes. So let's take a look at the two frames and what makes them different. So the two different styles of frame are the core or aluminum frame and traditional welded steel tube frame like the Vegas, Kingpin, Jackpot, Hammer, Gunner, or Judge. So you can see here this is a traditional style welded steel tube frame on a Vegas. And now even though the bikes may look completely different than the core frame stuff like the Vision and Cross Country, the drivetrain is the same and the diagnosis will be the same. So the other frame category in the group from 08 to 15 is the core frame. The core frame covers the cross country and the Vision models. The core frame refers to the cast aluminum frame, which is the backbone and the airbox on both the cross country and Vision. And I know it's completely different than your traditional steel frame bike like we just showed you, but the diagnosis will be the same. So here we have one of the most popular models, the cross country, and we're going to use that for today's demonstration on a bike that doesn't start, something that runs poorly, and then we'll just go through some operational procedures for your Victory.
Alright, so on every bike that comes in the shop with a no-start situation, we always go immediately to the battery. The battery on the cross bikes and the Visions is located in the front. In the cross country in particular, it's located behind this grill right here. It's held in by 4mm bolts. I'll just go ahead and take this last one out. And the grill kind of just pops out like that. And your battery is located right here.
So with any battery, we want to make sure that it's got at least 12.5 volts from sitting here. Oftentimes it'll have more. And you want to make sure that the terminals are clean and tight. The cross countries in particular are notorious for having the battery terminals loosen up over time, which will make the bike run horrible. So some really simple, easy, basic diagnosis is just to go in here, make sure your battery is clean, tight, and it's got plenty of voltage. All right, now that we've checked the battery, we've swapped bikes, and we're going to check the spark plugs. The spark plugs are the next logical part of the diagnosis. We're going to use a 45-degree angled needle nose pliers to pop the boot off. And I've pre-loosened the spark plug. Just pop it out of there. Take a look to make sure it's clean, dry, the electrode isn't worn, and it's in general good shape. This one looks good. So the last points I wanted to hit on the diagnosis of a bike that doesn't start is this flasher relay back here. And I've seen a few of these this year even, where the flasher or something will go wrong in the flasher relay and it won't allow the bike to start. It can manifest itself in different ways. Sometimes you can make it start by pulling in the clutch handle, and other times it's just nothing. And really the only way to diagnose it is to get a good known unit and just unplug it and plug it into the new one and see if the bike starts. It doesn't really help the guy at home, but that is something that's common. Maybe if you got a buddy with the same bike, try that flasher relay. So between the battery, the flasher relay, the spark plugs, there's not a lot of common stuff that we see that would cause a bike like this, an 08 to 15, to not start. Something that you might see is, I have heard of some starters going out, and you would just test to make sure it's getting power to the starter if you're just getting a click when you hit the start button. Otherwise, another thing that I see, especially in cold climates, is if when you go to start the bike, it's spinning, it's making a noise, but it's not the engine turning over noise. And that can be if your bike has backfired, it's ruined the sprag clutch for the starter, and it's just spinning the starter without actually turning over the motor. So that's pretty much it for basic diagnosis on a bike that won't start. Victory's got a pretty reliable bike here. There's only a couple basic things that we typically see. So let's move on now to something, to stuff that we would see with the bike that starts but runs poorly. So a real common problem on the cross countries and Visions is the circuit breaker. And you can see that Gabe has removed the grill on this cross country, and now he's removing the left-hand chin panel to expose the circuit breaker. The circuit breaker definitely will cause runnability issues. A lot of the times you'll see your dash lights flashing or the bike cutting out at random times, and the circuit breaker is a super common problem that we see oftentimes, especially in the cross countries and Visions. So once the chin fairing and the grill are removed, you can see the circuit breaker here, and you want to make sure it's got the same voltage on the inside as it does on the outside. And a lot of times it'll take a quick wrap from an insulated tool, and a lot of times you can do this with the bike running, and if you wrap it and the bike starts cutting out and the dash lights are flashing, then you know you got a really bad circuit breaker. A lot of times I'll ground out one side, put the hot side on the out terminal, and wrap it. This one's nice and solid, so we can rule that out. All right, now that we've checked the circuit breaker and made sure that it's good, we're just going to check the charging voltage, and I'm going to fire up the bike for this test, and we're just going to make sure that at idle it's about 14.3 volts. I think the spec in the book recommends that you rev the thing to 2,000 RPM, but honestly, if it's not putting out 14.3, 14.4 at idle, there's definitely a problem. So another common problem, especially on the 2008 models, is the throttle body boot. Gabe's going to remove the coil for clarity on this bike, which will expose the throttle body boot. And if you've watched the other videos, this is another problem commonly found on the Victories. So the throttle body boot is here, and this is what it's supposed to look like. But in 2008 especially, they had a really bad batch, and you can see this one is completely broken in half. And so you don't want to do just a cursory glance, you want to really look this thing over hard and make sure that there's no splits or cracks, or it's not delaminating from its aluminum backing. If it does, that'll cause a major air leak, and of course it'll run very poorly at that point. So since we're in here with the coil off and we're looking for cracks on the throttle body boot, we're also going to look for cracks on an idle air valve hoses, and this is a 2008 to 15 specific thing that you won't find on the other models of bikes. You can see these preformed plastic tubes here, which are the idle air valve hoses, and then here I have one off the bike And you can see these tubes come up and they inject air into the throttle body, and these ends are all rubber and they're notorious for cracking. And when you have a crack, you have an air leak, which will make it run poorly. So not only are we going to check this rubber piece underneath the throttle body, we're also going to check these. And again, don't do a cursory glance. A split that will cause a runnability issue can be very small, and it can be in either of these, or it could be at the idle air valve on the other side, because there's two large pieces of rubber here as well. So another common problem that we would see on these bikes would be fuel delivery. In 2002 to 2007, they had a lot of pump failures, and we're not seeing a whole bunch of that on the new stuff, although it can happen. What we're seeing more of is plugged fuel filters. And unfortunately, we won't be able to test the fuel pressure on this bike because it requires a special Victory tool. But if your bike's got 25,000 or more miles on it, especially if it's a cross bike or a steel frame, then we're definitely going to think about putting a fuel filter in it because it can cause runnability issues. The Vision, they list a 50,000 mile interval on that, so it's not as big as a problem, but we have fixed quite a few bikes with just putting fuel filters in them, so that's something to keep in mind. So again, Victory's made huge strides in making a very reliable bike, and we've covered a lot of the basic diagnosis here on a bike that won't start or that runs poorly. Again, the battery, making sure that it's got plenty of voltage and that the terminals are clean and tight and your circuit breaker isn't going bad, to the spark plugs and making sure they're not fouled out and they're clean and not worn out, to check into air leaks, especially on the 08 bikes, the throttle body boot, and the idle air valve hoses that are in there. If all those check out and you still have a bike that runs poorly or doesn't start, I would recommend seeing a professional mechanic, because we've hit the major points so far in this video. So next, Gabe and I will just shoot a couple ideas out on the best practices for running your bike. So just like any Victory model, when we go to start the bike, I like to crack the throttle open just a little. And I realize that these 08 to 15 bikes, the idle's regulated by the idle air valve, but a lot of times just giving a little bit of throttle, especially when it's cold, while you bump that start button will help it start a lot more reliably. And this is extremely important in cold climates, like anything under 50 degrees ambient temperature. These big 106 motors are very hard to turn over, and it's important that you twist the throttle when you hit the start button, because it'll keep the bike from backfiring. And a very common problem with a cold Victory is that it'll backfire. You may come up and you just hit the start button like that, and it's going to turn over and backfire, and then you've just cost yourself about $250 to replace the starter clutch. So when it's cold out, let's just make sure, well, all the time, let's make sure that we give it a little bit of throttle when we hit that start button. All right, now that we've got a bike that starts and runs properly and we've covered the startup procedure, I want to cover the warm-up procedure. It's really important with any Victory model, especially these, that they come to full temperature before you ride it. So a lot of times we'll start the bike up as we were showing you earlier, set it on the side stand and walk away for a few minutes. Go finish your cup of coffee, pack the saddlebags, get your helmet on, and then reach down and make sure the cylinders are warm before you take off. That's going to keep the piston from scuffing and doing some extreme engine damage. So don't be that guy at bike night revving out his cold motor. It's not that cool. The last thing I wanted to cover is the oil change procedure. It is as simple as changing the oil in your car. The drain plug is under the left-hand side of the engine case. Down here, it's a 6mm Allen. There's a copper crush washer that goes around it, and then the filter is on the back side of the motor. Obviously, drain, replace the filter, put this back in with the copper crush washer. And the dipstick is on the opposite side. It's a 5-quart system, but you'll never get 5 quarts out of it. Generally, it's 4, 4.5, somewhere in that area. So what we'll do is drain it all out, put 4, 4.5 quarts in, run the engine, get it up to temperature, let it sit for a couple of minutes, dip the dipstick back in. The oil has to be checked with the bike standing upright. So just, let that be the final determination on how much oil you add to it. Well, we're almost out of time for today, so I wanted to go through what we covered on today's video. What I was explaining is that all the Victory models from 2008 to new have the same drivetrain, even though they may be different models like the steel frame, Hammer, Vegas, Jackpot line, or the core frame division in the cross country. So we used a cross country as an example of a bike that didn't start, as an example of a bike that ran poorly, and then we just went over some basic troubleshooting and maintenance and how to run your bike. So thank you for watching. I hope you found it informative, and I hope you think of the Vic Shop the next time you have a question on your Victory. Happy wrenching!